So we want to take some time today at Slee Off-Road and talk about wheel spacers. They are so simple and yet so complicated. So we want to give some details on these as to why you would choose a certain type, some of the design characteristics, and some of the vehicle applications that these all go on. This is a pretty good example in front of me of as far as the different wheel spacers that we offer. They fit pretty much all Toyota vehicles. These are all made by Spidertrax. They're all made here in the U.S. of all U.S. materials and U.S. components. And we feel very strongly that if they're installed properly, that you will have a very reliable, durable application. One thing to mention is that all wheel spacers from Spidertrax are intended to be used with the factory Toyota wheel. The Spidertrax wheel spacers vary in some heights, and that variance is due to the different vehicles they go on. The main goal on the height that's chosen on the wheel spacer is such that when you install the wheel spacer, it covers the length of the factory wheel studs. Behind me is our Tundra. The Tundra wheel spacers are 1 inch in thickness, and that is dictated by the length of the factory Toyota wheel studs. So with this installed, you can see that the wheel stud is buried, and there's no concern about the wheel stud protruding into the back of the wheel. That would obviously be a concern and a problem, and the wheel would not be installed properly. In some cases, such as this wheel spacer, this is 1.5 inches. Again, the wheel studs of the vehicle that this goes on, they happen to be longer from the factory. So it was chosen by Spidertrax. They're always looking for the minimum thickness. Chosen by Spidertrax on this application that it needed to be thicker because the factory wheel studs are also longer. So that is the main reason why the variance on the wheel spacer thickness. So this one is 1 inch, 1.25 inches, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, all for different vehicles. So there's the difference on the thicknesses. Let's go into the next step. Hub-centric versus non-hub-centric, or hub-centric versus lug-centric. In most cases, most factory Toyota wheels are hub-centric. Hub-centric indicating that the wheel is centered onto what is called the hub register. On the vehicle, the hub register is here, and on any hub-centric wheel spacer, that hub register is then transferred from the vehicle onto the wheel spacer, ensuring that the wheel is centered on this and then only held on by the wheel studs. Now, out of all the wheel spacers that we sell, we only have one part number that is lug-centric. Now, this is hub-centric onto the vehicle itself, so it will center on the vehicle. However, the wheel itself is only centered by the lug nuts. Now, the reason why this one is different is to fit all Toyota applications that have serviceable wheel bearings. With a serviceable wheel bearing, the vehicle hub, it protrudes much further, and it does not allow for the step down of a hub-centric wheel spacer. On a longer serviceable wheel bearing vehicle, this will go on and it actually will get caught on the wheel hub. So that requires a non-hub-centric wheel spacer. Most times these vehicles are going to be your 40 series, 60 series, 80 series Land Cruisers. That also covers essentially 1995 and older Toyota pickups and 4Runners. So that is important. On many of those vehicles, if you have a wheel that has a conical lug nut, that conical lug nut will center the wheel onto the wheel spacer, and there's no concern. Really, where we have a little bit of a hiccup is on the 80 series Land Cruiser. There was 3 different wheels that came on an 80 series Land Cruiser. 91 and 92 had a 15-inch wheel that had a conical lug nut, no problem at all. 93 and 94 had a wheel that also used a conical lug nut, assuming that wheel is still on there. We're talking about a 30-year-old vehicle. Where there's a little bit of confusion is on 95 through 97 Land Cruiser. That wheel looks aesthetically the same as the 93, 94. However, it used a shoulder lug nut, such as this. The challenge with a shoulder lug nut is that the lug nut does not center the wheel onto the wheel spacer. In this small case, we have 3 years of vehicle here. What we recommend doing is installing the spacer as you normally would, installing the wheel onto the wheel spacer, and on 2 of the adjacent wheel studs, you would use a conical lug nut. You can source those from your auto parts store, source them from any wheel and tire shop. Use a conical lug nut adjacent from each other, tighten those down just hand tight. That will center the wheel on the wheel stud. On the remaining 4, you're going to use the factory Toyota lug nuts right on there. Tighten those down properly and then remove the conical lug nuts and finally install the proper lug nuts from Toyota. That'll ensure that the wheel is installed on the wheel spacer. You're using the proper lug nut for the wheel spacer on the final install, and you're good to go on your 95, 97 Land Cruiser. Just about everything else, or any aftermarket wheels that are used with this particular wheel spacer on these applications, you're going to use the conical lug nuts, and there will be no concern. That's the only hiccup. Everything else that we have here is pretty straightforward. The second wheel spacer you see here, this is a 6 on 5.5 bolt pattern, very traditional to Toyota. This goes back really 95 and newer Tacomas, 95 and newer 4Runners, anything with a unit bearing. So that's going to also include your GX460s, GX470s, anything with that traditional 6 on 5.5 bolt pattern is going to be covered on this wheel spacer. Again, this is 1.25 inches thick. Here we have a bolt pattern that was new to Toyota back in 1998. This particular wheel spacer is intended for 100 Series Land Cruiser, 200 Series Land Cruiser, 2nd Gen Tundra, 2nd Gen Sequoia is all going to fit this one here. All of these wheels from Toyota use a shoulder lug nut, and all these wheel spacers from Slee Off-Road and Spidertrax are hub-centric. This particular wheel spacer is shown for the front of a 100 Series Land Cruiser. The 100 Series Land Cruiser does have, it's unique, it does have the 5 on 150 bolt pattern as well as serviceable wheel bearings. These extra cutouts here that you see on the hub register are to allow clearance of the drive flange and the hardware that holds that drive flange on. So arguably this spacer is intended for a front of a 100 Series only. However, it can fit in the rear of or the front and rear of any of the other vehicles. It's just a slightly more expensive wheel spacer to make. One thing good to point out here is obviously bolt pattern is 5. It's an odd pattern. Inside here, the factory drive flange is 6-lug drive flange. So you have an even number here, you have an odd number here. When you go to install it on the vehicle, it will not install in every single orientation, being that you have an even number and odd number. So if you slide it on and it doesn't fit, pull it back off, rotate it one set of holes, put it back on, and then it will fit just fine, but it will not fit every single orientation. So something important to remember on the 100 Series Land Cruiser. So included with all wheel spacers, and specifically the 100 Series Land Cruiser, sometimes there are some areas that create some conflict with the installation of the wheel spacer. Again, in this case, this is a brand new vehicle, very easy and straightforward. Many cases we're working on a 10, 20, 30, 40-year-old vehicle, and there's some things that have to be sensitive to during the installation. Obviously, keeping the factory hub register nice and clean, the mating surface of the rotor or the wheel hub needs to be nice and clean or cleaned off on an older vehicle. Pertaining to the 100 Series Land Cruiser again, there are some things that can also create a conflict because it has a drive flange that bolts on. We have seen where aftermarket nuts are used or aftermarket washers that will hang over and actually create conflict when this wheel spacer becomes installed. Due to some corrosion on here when the spacer goes on, sometimes there is some resistance. It's important to get all of that surface clean, ensure that the hardware that's holding your drive flange on is factory. And in some cases, even with all that work, you get a wheel spacer on, you get it on about 90%. In a perfect world, you want to hear that it's a nice solid fit, but in some cases you have a little bit of a drag. We recommend putting a couple lug nuts on and by hand, no power tools, go ahead and just tighten 2 wheel studs that are opposite each other and pull it on. As long as you get a nice seat, you're good to go. Some wheel spacers are a little bit more drag than the other, but as long as you ensure that that surface is nice and clean, you don't have any gap between the wheel spacer and the rotor or the wheel hub, then you should have a nice, clean, reliable installation. So lastly, these machine marks here, these are indicative of the 100 Series front wheel spacer. Obviously the ones that you get for the rear would be completely smooth here, more similar to this wheel spacer here. So not all of them have to have those machine marks, but 100 Series front only. Lastly, we have our wheel spacer that fits our 2022 and up Tundra, 23 and up Sequoia, LX600, as well as 300 Series Land Cruiser that we don't have here, but wheel spacer still fits. One thing that's neat to talk about is obviously we have a few different bolt patterns, a few different wheel stud diameters. Toyota made it a little confusing. They went from a 5 on 150 bolt pattern on the Tundra and Land Cruiser, and they changed it back to 6 on 5.5. You can see the bolt circuit is a little bit smaller. The second thing that they did is they actually retained the 14 mil wheel studs onto the new Tundra. The traditional 6 on 5.5 that we're so familiar with the other Toyotas use a 12 millimeter wheel stud. So although the bolt pattern is something that we're all familiar with the older Toyotas, 6 on 5.5, it is not the same. 14 millimeter wheel studs versus 12 millimeter wheel studs. The other thing they changed drastically was the hub register. You can see here, the hub register on the traditional 6 on 5.5 is much larger. The hub register on the new Tundra is much smaller. So the idea is that Toyota did not allow you to use the original wheels that may have come on your 4Runner or your GX or such, or even many of the aftermarket wheels that were originally intended for the earlier Toyotas on 6 and 5.5. They do not work with the wheel stud diameter and the hub register on the new Tundras, Sequoias, Land Cruisers and such. So it is a whole new part. it does require attention to be paid, that you're using the right parts that have come out for the right truck. And these wheel spacers are just that. So as we started with, nothing simple about wheel spacers. I think we went through most of the differences, the challenges, some of the design characteristics that are different. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to answer your questions and try to get you the right product for your application. We have a second video. Please look that up as far as installation onto the vehicle. Other than that, if we can help you in any way, please let us know. Thank you for joining us. And any other questions, please visit sleeoffroad.com or give us a call.